The middle class is struggling to survive.
It affects my budget. It affects my family also. I can't afford to buy the food that they need because I got to put it in gas.
From rent and groceries to power and gas, everything is getting expensive, and wages aren't keeping up with the expenses.
If you work at a restaurant, retail, or any low-paying job, you're probably caught up in a financial nightmare.
Almost every person dreams of owning a house and a nice car. Our parents were able to make that a reality with time, but this generation might never be able to. Many Americans think this is the case everywhere in the world, but no. There are places where the middle class isn't just surviving, but thriving. So where are those places? What lifestyle does the middle class live there, and how are they doing it? Let's find out. This is the story of the modern middle class, where it has disappeared from and where it is truly growing. Middle class in the United States of America. Before we look into the places where the middle class is thriving, let's examine the middle class in America and analyze their problems. The US federal government raised the minimum wage to $7.25 in 2009. While this was a good amount at the time, it's not the same today, given continued inflation. Prices of everything are going up. The median price for houses sold in the US has gone from $214,000 in 2009 to $419,000 in the last quarter of 2024. That's almost double in the period of the same minimum wage. It's not just buying a house that's become difficult. House rent is also increasing at an average rate of 3 to 4% per year. Another major problem is the high cost of basic needs such as health and education. Starting with education, the average yearly tuition at a private school in the US stood at $12,350 in 2021. This included the average tuition at a private high school of $16,040 and the average tuition at a private elementary school of $7,630. At the same time, the median household income stands at around $80,000. So if you're a family of 5 with 3 children in school, half your paycheck goes into their tuition. And that's before they get into college, because once they do, the cost of tuition rises significantly. Now, let's get to the health section.
Wait, no, please don't call an ambulance. I can't afford an ambulance.
Since most of you have seen such clips in American movies, you would know how expensive healthcare is in the US, even if you're not an American. In terms of numbers, Americans spend $12,473 per capita on healthcare, which is more than any other country on the planet. Many Americans get health insurance from private companies, but that system is quite complex and many still get hefty bills. And keep in mind, even if you were getting insurance, it's not cheap. The average annual cost of health insurance in the US stood at $7,739 for an individual and $22,221 for a family in 2021. That's more than a quarter of median household income. So why is it so expensive to afford basic necessities in the US, which is literally the wealthiest country on the planet? The root problem is the unequal distribution of American wealth. In terms of wealth inequality, the US ranks 34th out of 172 countries, meaning that 80% of the world offers lesser economic indifferences between its citizens than the US. Because of these problems, the US middle class is struggling to survive, but that's not the case everywhere. So let's explore the rest of the world and see how they're keeping their middle class thriving. Let's start with Northern European countries, otherwise known as the Scandinavian countries. Middle class in Scandinavia. This region of the world map is known as Scandinavia. Although the Scandinavian region might consist of 5 distinct countries, their culture, lifestyle, and welfare systems are very similar, so we've grouped them together. By the way, before we move any further, if you enjoy learning more about today's economic stories, be sure to subscribe. The Scandinavian countries are quite wealthy. One of them, Norway, even has a higher per capita income than the US. But unlike the US, they rank much lower in terms of wealth inequality, which means there's a lesser class difference. Sweden ranks at 104th position, Denmark 116th, Norway 117th, Finland 120th, and Iceland 124th. While these rankings are much better than those of the US, they're still not the best, as around 50 countries still have a more fair wealth distribution than Scandinavian countries. How are these countries among the best for middle-class citizens? Well, the system may not be ideal, but the government really cares for its citizens. In all these countries, citizens get free education at public institutions of all levels. And it's not just education. Scandinavians also get healthcare at public hospitals for a minimal amount. Citizens of these countries pay a very small amount of money for healthcare. And what makes this possible is the public health insurance system. Governments cover 75 to 85% of the medical bills, leaving patients with only a minimal amount. In Sweden, there are patient co-payments and cost sharing. It facilitates adult patients to share the cost of prescription drugs with the state. Due to this, only a tiny amount remains to be paid by the patient. Low-income patients and patients with certain chronic conditions sometimes don't have to pay at all. Similarly, there are also various government programs to house the people who are going through rough times. With basic necessities covered, the lower and middle classes do not need to worry about survival and can focus on growing even if financial risks are involved. So the government taxing the rich and then providing the basic needs of all citizens can make a thriving middle class. Americans really could learn something from them, but they're not the only countries America could learn from. Let's head to China. The middle class in China.
Increasing prosperity in China has led to the rise of a powerful middle class. Businesses around the globe are taking notice.
This news clip from Bloomberg dates back to March 2012, and since then, things have only improved for China, which once again had one of the poorest populations on the planet. China's economic development has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and resulted in a large middle class. In 2000, China's middle class amounted to just 3% of its population. By 2018, this number had climbed to over half of the population, constituting nearly 707 million people. China's per capita gross national income stood at $24.4 thousand in 2023, an increase of almost 20 times from 2000, when it stood at $2.9 thousand. So how did Chinese people get to improve their lifestyle so much? Well, China started to grow rapidly by the end of the 20th century, and since then it has grown into the second richest country on the planet. Its growth has been fueled by the manufacturing industry, specifically their large population, which was once all unskilled labor. Basically, they brought in the manufacturing industry from around the globe, making maximum jobs. What could have happened was that some Chinese capitalist would get control over all of the manufacturing plants, leaving the vast majority with a minimum wage. However, the Chinese government avoided that by gradually raising the minimum wage. Chinese governments have increased the minimum wage from 960 yen per month to 2,690 yen per month. That's almost triple during the time period of a constant minimum wage in America. You might be wondering how this did not make companies stop their business in China and move their manufacturing plants elsewhere. Well, actually, this made for a richer middle class, which made way for foreign food chains and clothing brands to start their outlets in China, creating even more jobs for Chinese people. We understand that unlike China, the US is not a manufacturing-based economy. However, if the US were to raise the minimum wage or take other measures to improve the living standards of workers, it would be one way to make a thriving middle class. But China isn't the only place in Asia with a thriving middle class. Let's head south and take a look at India. The middle class in India.
The Indian middle class will not just represent a maximum part of the India's population, but will also hold the powers to drive the Indian economy.
As per 2022 figures, 31% of India was considered to be middle class. The percentage is expected to double by 2047. Some think that the middle class of India in the future is going to be very similar to that of China right now, but in reality they'd be even better. India's middle class has many unique features. It is the youngest globally, which typically translates to greater dynamism economically and politically compared to counterparts in China and the US. Also, unlike in China, where the middle class is growing only in urban cities of eastern provinces, the middle class in India is associated with more inclusive growth, as its growth is not concentrated but spatially dispersed across India in both urban and rural sectors. India's rapidly growing middle class is also a driving force behind the rising domestic market, with growth in the purchase of homes, cars, refrigerators, motorcycles, and digital goods and services. So, how is India creating such an ideal middle class? Basically, India has benefited from a service revolution. Its IT outsourcing industry is still considered one of the largest exports of IT and business processing outsourcing services. The industry has been on an increasing growth curve for the past several decades. Technological advancements in internet access, cloud computing, and state-of-the-art data centers have significantly contributed to propelling India's middle class into prominence in the global technology landscape. Unlike China, which capitalized on its cheap, unskilled labor, India is using its large pool of cheap, semi-skilled and skilled labor. India offers another story on how to utilize your large population into making healthy and thriving middle class. Just like Scandinavia, China, and India, there are countless other countries and regions with thriving middle classes. Bangladesh used its women population and trained them to work in the garment industry, and now has the richest population in South Asia. Singapore focuses on educating and skill training its citizens, and now it is not just among the richest countries, but also has a rising, thriving middle class. There are countless other stories too, but hey, I'm not going to tell you all of them. Why don't you share some of your favorite middle class stories from around the globe in the comments? Also, let us know what you think the US can do to make America's middle class into a thriving middle class. Share with us your thoughts in the comment section, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to stay tuned. See you in the next video soon.